So the purpose of this video is to get us outside the United States a little bit and look at some poverty measurements from the developed world. The first one is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, which is a pretty influential group of countries. The OECD was established in 1961. It has 35 members today. And the mission of the OECD is basically growth and improvement in social well-being, not just in its member countries, but also people around the world. It has a research function. It monitors and analyzes social and economic data from all of its member countries. It sends out reports and projections and comparisons. It serves as a forum where countries can provide peer review of other countries' policies and initiatives and how they're succeeding in the goals of producing economic growth and improving social well-being. Occasionally, the OECD results in formal agreements or treaties between countries. Not always. That's not its primary function. Here's a map of the OECD member countries, and as you can see, we're basically talking about the global north. You see Australia there and Chile, and they're an exception to the rule, but you can see that some countries, most notably Russia, have started talks to join the OECD, and you can see in the lightest color here countries that have expressed interest in joining. So there may be some movement into the global south of the OECD, but for the most part it exists in the global north. Now, the way in which the OECD measures poverty, they still use a threshold approach, and it's still a household approach, and it's still single-dimensional. It's focused on income. However, the OECD uses an income concept, which is closer but not identical to the concept of household resources from the supplemental poverty measure. It's post-tax and transfer, and they call this disposable income. And it's not totally identical with household resources, but it's pretty close. But the main difference is that the threshold is completely relative, not absolute at all. And they use a standard of 50% or less of the median household income in the member country. And the thresholds are equivalized for different sizes of households and different ages of people in the households using a standardized scale. So on our map here, the way in which the OECD's approach to poverty measurement would come out is pretty straightforward. It's still an objective measurement, it's still single-dimensional, but it is totally relative, and it is solely focused on the dimension of income. Now, what would poverty look like in the United States if we look through the lens of the OECD? Well, actually, the OECD gets its information from statistical agencies in its member countries, and the Census Bureau is designated to be the agency that reports data to the OECD. But when they report to the OECD, they have to make several adjustments with the data to the data that they have. They have to calculate income post-tax and transfer, and they have to calculate it according to the income concept of disposable income. And the OECD uses a slightly different equivalent scale for adjusting the thresholds for different sizes of households and different ages of people in the households than we do, than the Census Bureau does. So they have to use the OECD's equivalent scale and slightly adjust their income numbers so that they can match the OECD's framework. But pretty much every year you'll find this little nugget in the annual report that the Census Bureau puts out. Because they are the reporter to the OECD, they almost always include what our poverty rate would be. And so this is from page 20 of the most recent annual report, and you can see that if we use the OECD measurement, our poverty rate would be 22.9%. So significantly higher. Now, the OECD also monitors, besides relative income poverty, measured as 50% of median, also monitors a portfolio of other indicators related to poverty and inequality. They monitor poverty gaps, the Gini index, 2 different 90-10 ratios, and some other ratios, almost all dealing with income. And we'll have a chance to look at their data on this in class a little bit. Another influential multinational organization is the European Union. And so this is our second outside the U.S. approach to poverty measurement for today. The European Union has 28 member countries. It began mostly for economic purposes, trade and so on, after the Second World War. But since then, it has branched out beyond just facilitating trade between countries, branched out to many policy areas to include climate, health, security, migration, and pretty much everything else. They changed their name from the European Economic Community to the European Union in 1993. It's all based on treaties between the member countries, and in 2012, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. If you think about all of the wars that have been fought in Europe over the years, it's a lot. And so one thing is that Europe, at least Western Europe, has been pretty peaceful since they've had this union. And the stated goal of the EU is pretty lofty: peace, stability, and prosperity throughout Europe. And here's a map of the European Union member countries and their 2-letter country codes. And it'll be helpful. We'll be looking at some of these 2-letter country codes in class. You can see that Norway and Switzerland, interestingly, are not formal members of the EU. They do pretty much cooperate and have agreements to play along with all the policy areas of the EU, but they are not formal members. The United Kingdom, you can see the last one on the list, is still a member, although they did vote to leave recently. That process is going to take quite a while because they're going to have to negotiate away all of those treaties. So it'll take several years, but they did vote to leave. There are several countries that are being considered as candidates, and most of them are really down in the Balkan area. You can see Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And Turkey is a possibility. They're in talks to join the EU. Now, every year the EU puts out what they call a dashboard. And they call it the Social Protection Performance Monitor dashboard. And this dashboard is compiled by a bunch of EU statisticians every year for the EU's Social Protection Committee, which is a large committee and a pretty powerful committee evaluating basically social welfare policies throughout the EU. And the goal of the people who put together this dashboard is to present social affairs ministers from all the EU member countries, to present them with a lot of information in a very small amount of space. So the dashboard utilizes a portfolio approach, and that means that they have a ton of indicators. They almost always include about 24, 25. I think they may be adding a few more here in the next few years, but the centerpiece of the portfolio is always this key indicator called AROPE, and AROPE stands for at risk of poverty or social exclusion. So you should see a little sort of light here. There's a totally new concept introduced, social exclusion. So AROPE as an indicator is defined as the sum of people who are at risk of poverty and people who have very low work intensity, or VLWI, and people who experience severe material deprivation, or SMD. And you take the sum of all people who are any of those three things: at risk of poverty, have very low work intensity, or have severe material deprivation, and you divide that by the total population of the member state in order to get the AROPE rate. So for the overall EU, the AROPE rate in 2014 was 24.4%. And there's great variation among EU countries. The high in 2014 was in Romania and Bulgaria at 40%, and the low was in the Czech Republic at 14.8%. Now, the first of the three components of AROPE is very, very simple. At risk of poverty, to be at risk of poverty in the EU means to have disposable income, again, post-redistribution, post-tax and transfer, to have disposable income below 60% of the median in the member state. So everyone who belongs to a household that has post-tax and transfer income below 60% of the median for that state would be considered at risk of poverty. So a ROP, at risk of poverty, is again pretty straightforward. Just like the OECD, it's an objective measure. It's a single-dimensional measure, totally relative, totally focused on income. It's simply that the EU sets the threshold 10 percentiles higher than the OECD does at the 60th percentile. Now, VLWI is very low work intensity. They are changing their terminology a little bit on very low work intensity. They're talking now about quasi-jobless households. But for now, it's still VLWI. And this is the percentage of people under 60, so 0 to 59. We're not dealing with people over 60 at all. They're excluded from this indicator, who are living in households where working age adults, 18 to 59, cumulatively work 20% or less of their maximum work intensity. So it's important to know that full-time students between 18 and 24 years of age are also excluded before this calculation is done. And the way they do this is they take the number of months worked in any household by all non-student household members who are 18 to 59, and they calculate this in full-time equivalent terms. So if a working age non-student adult reports working 6 months at half-time, then it would be calculated as 3 months. So it's a full-time equivalent. If a person reports working 8 months at quarter time, it would be reported as 2 months. So, and the standard for full-time work varies in EU countries. Some EU countries consider full-time work to be 35 hours a week. Some consider it to be 40 hours a week. And they use the standard in each country. And so you take the months worked by all non-student members, full-time equivalized, and then you divide that by the maximum months all working age household members could have worked. And that gives you your VLWI rate. Now, VLWI as an indicator is also objective, single-dimensional. It is absolute, but what we're seeing here in this work intensity indicator is the first measure trying to capture capabilities. The reason that very low work intensity is of concern to the EU is because it's considered an indicator of social exclusion. People who live in quasi-jobless households or very low work intensity households are probably also going to be low income, but they are being excluded from sort of social ties and social involvement, a very important arena of social involvement, which is involvement through the workplace. And capabilities refers to what people are actually able to do and to be. And one thing people are able to do and to be is workers. And so the reason that VLWI is a concerning statistic for the EU is that it's a limitation on what people are able to do and to be. Severe material deprivation, the third component of AROPE, refers to the total number of people in households where any 4 of these 9 items can't be afforded. Now, the EU has a thing called the Survey on Income and Living Conditions, or the SILC. And the way this question is worded is, and it's asked of a representative adult in the household, which of these could you not afford even if you wanted to afford them? So it controls for the fact that some people may not want these things. So these items vary greatly. As you can see, being unable to afford to pay your rent, being unable to afford to keep your home adequately warm, being unable to face unexpected expenses, and usually the interviewers in the SILC will put an amount on that, and it's usually adjusted for the standard of living in the country. And it's usually about, 1/10 of a family, of an average family's monthly income. But it varies. The surveyors ask that question with a different amount in each country. And other items, not being able to afford to eat meat or proteins, they also do say vegetarian substitutes. Every second day, regularly every second day, an inability to afford to go on a 1-week holiday or vacation, inability to afford a television set, a washing machine, a car, and a telephone. So if the household respondent says, no, we couldn't afford 4 of these 9 things, they're counted as severely materially deprived. If it's only 3 things, they're not counted as severely materially deprived. And if they answer yes for all 9 of these items, it doesn't get more extreme. It's just severely materially deprived. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the SMD indicator, and because of the way the question is worded, which of these could you not afford even if you wanted to, and because of the way that some of these questions require subjective judgment, so adequately warm, well, that might be different for an older couple as opposed to another type of household. So there's been some debate about whether the questions are subjective. The SMD indicator is presented as an objective indicator because it's just 4 of 9, but it does call for some subjectivity. So some argue that it's mixed. It's partly subjective and partly objective. And there's also some debate about whether it's single-dimensional or multidimensional. Obviously, it's it's taking into account consumption. The question is about affordability. What could you not buy if you wanted to buy it? So clearly consumption is in the mix, and it was designed as a consumption indicator. SMD was designed that way. But because of this issue about a week-long vacation being on the list, and things like a car being on the list, some people have said that also standards of living are involved here, and that this indicator is mixed. It's absolute in the sense that it's a simple 4 out of 9. 4 yeses puts you in the bucket of severely materially deprived. But there is some relativity in the sense that some things that are considered to be non-necessities are on the list. But AROPE as a whole, if you take into account all 3, is obviously going to be multidimensional because of these questions about the subjectivity of severe material deprivation. You could say that it's mixed on subjectivity and objectivity as well. The Social Protection Committee sees it as an objective indicator and reports it as an objective indicator. But if you take all 3 components of at risk of poverty or social exclusion, you're dealing at least with standards of living, income, consumption, and capabilities. There are no questions about wealth or asset building. There are no indicators for that taken into consideration in AROPE. Now, of the total number of households that were at risk of poverty or social exclusion, 70% of them were at risk by the relative income poverty indicator. And smaller numbers of them, 36% of the total number of households counted as at risk, were severely materially deprived. They had 4 out of 9 of those things that they could not afford even if they wanted to. And 34% of total AROPE households had very low work intensity. So it's clearly the income poverty indicator that accounts for the largest share of AROPE. Of course, some households are all 3. They're at risk of relative income poverty, they're severely materially deprived, and they have very low work intensity. So, as I said, the dashboard takes a portfolio approach, and all of these other indicators are also reported as trends to watch, in addition to AROPE itself. They watch what they call persistent AROP, which is people who experienced relative income poverty in the current year and in at least 2 out of the 3 preceding years. So this is kind of like our concept of chronic poverty. They monitor child risk of poverty or social exclusion, and they measure elderly risk of poverty and social exclusion. They measure the impact of redistribution, taxes and transfers, on relative income poverty. They measure in-work poverty, people who are employed and in poverty. They measure long-term unemployment, what they call early school leavers, which is basically a dropout rate, youth unemployment, older workers' unemployment rates. These NEETs, these are 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in education, employment, or training. We tend to call these disconnected youth. And several other social welfare indicators, including things like how many healthy life years you're expected to have at 65 years old. So it's a life expectancy basically at 65. They pay attention to things like, the proportion of the population that is dealing with severe housing cost burdens, and gross household disposable income, changes in gross household disposable income over time. So AROPE is really nested in this larger dashboard of indicators that the Social Protection Committee and the Social Affairs Ministers of each EU member country look at each year. The goal of the EU in its current strategic plan, which is called Europe 2020, very catchy, is to reduce the number of people who are at risk of poverty or social exclusion by 20 million. Sounds good, right? 20 million by 2020. And perhaps not surprisingly, they are not on target to meet this goal, largely because of the financial crisis. This target was set in 2010, and there's been so much recovery work to do that they're not currently on track with that, but that is their goal. So here are two other approaches to measuring poverty, and we'll have a chance to look at this dashboard a little more closely in class.